When Jesus declared, "All is fulfilled in me," he wasn't making a religious claim about his unique divinity. He was revealing the most transformational secret of spiritual consciousness that Joel Goldsmith spent decades teaching. This statement is actually an invitation for you to discover the same consciousness within yourself. Most people miss this completely. The word fulfilled in Aramaic carries a meaning far deeper than completion. It means made whole, brought to fullness, and accomplished in consciousness. Jesus was describing a state of being where nothing external is needed because everything already exists in spiritual awareness. This is not theology, but practical mysticism. Here's what Joel Goldsmith discovered that changes everything. When Jesus said, "In me," he wasn't referring to his personal human identity called Jesus of Nazareth. He was speaking from the Christ consciousness, the I Am presence that exists equally in every human being. This same presence is in you right now, waiting to be recognized. Most religious teaching tells you to seek God's blessings from outside yourself. You're taught to pray for things, ask for healing, beg for provision, and hope God will respond favorably. This creates a consciousness of separation and lack. Joel Goldsmith called this the great spiritual mistake that keeps millions in bondage to limitation and suffering. The truth Jesus demonstrated is radically different. When you understand all is fulfilled in me, you stop seeking and start recognizing. You stop asking and start acknowledging. You stop begging and start resting in the awareness that infinite spiritual resources already exist in your consciousness. This shift alone transforms everything. Joel taught that this principle operates through what he called recognition prayer versus petitionary prayer. Instead of asking God for something you lack, you recognize what already is. Instead of seeking healing, you acknowledge wholeness. Instead of pursuing supply, you rest in infinite abundance that exists in consciousness before it appears in form. Let me show you how this operates practically in daily life. When you face a challenge, your conditioned mind immediately goes into seeking mode. You start asking, "What can I do? Where can I get help? How can I fix this?" This consciousness of personal effort and external dependency actually blocks the flow of spiritual good that wants to express through you. But when you pause and recognize all is fulfilled in me, something shifts. You're not denying the appearance of the problem. You're acknowledging a higher truth. You're remembering that the Christ consciousness within you already contains the solution, the healing, the provision, the wisdom. Your role is simply to be still and let it emerge. Joel Goldsmith experienced this dramatically when facing his own health crisis. Instead of frantically seeking remedies, he turned within and recognized the presence of wholeness in his consciousness. Within weeks, his condition transformed completely. He wasn't healed by external treatment, but by the recognition of what was already true in spiritual reality. The key Joel emphasized is this: you cannot add anything to your spiritual identity. You cannot become more whole, more blessed, or more divine than you already are in consciousness. The moment you try to add something, you're operating from a belief in lack. That belief itself becomes the obstacle to experiencing your already fulfilled nature. This is why Jesus never begged God for anything. He didn't pray for the Father to give him power, wisdom, or ability. He recognized that the Father and he were one, that all the Father has was already his in consciousness. This wasn't arrogance, but clarity about spiritual identity. It's the same clarity available to you right now. When you truly grasp this principle, your entire approach to life transforms. You stop manipulating circumstances and start recognizing truth. You stop efforting and start resting. You stop seeking and start acknowledging. This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become spiritually intelligent, working from fullness rather than emptiness. Let me share what happened to Robert, a business executive who discovered this principle during a financial crisis. His company was failing, debts were mounting, and traditional solutions weren't working. Every consultant told him to work harder, strategize better, and push through. But Robert felt exhausted by the constant effort and anxiety. Then he encountered Joel Goldsmith's teaching about all is fulfilled in me. At first he thought it was spiritual bypassing, just positive thinking that ignored reality. But something drew him to experiment with it. He began taking moments throughout each day to pause and silently recognize all that I need is already present in consciousness. The solution exists before I seek it. What happened over the next 3 months surprised even Robert. He didn't receive a sudden windfall or miracle investor. Instead, his thinking clarified. He saw business opportunities he'd previously missed. Connections formed naturally. Resources appeared through unexpected channels. His company slowly stabilized and then began growing again. But more importantly, his entire relationship with provision transformed. Or consider Elizabeth, who struggled with chronic anxiety for 15 years. She'd tried therapy, medication, meditation apps, and every self-help technique available. Some things helped temporarily, but the underlying anxiety always returned. She was exhausted from the constant battle with her own mind and emotions. When Elizabeth learned about recognizing fulfillment in consciousness rather than seeking peace externally, something clicked. She realized she'd been fighting anxiety from a position of believing something was wrong with her. Every technique was another form of seeking to fix a problem. But what if wholeness was already present beneath the anxious thoughts? She began practicing what Joel called the art of non-reaction. Instead of trying to eliminate anxiety, she would pause and recognize, peace is fulfilled in my true consciousness right now. She didn't deny the anxious feelings, but stopped giving them the power of ultimate reality. Over 6 months, the anxiety episodes decreased dramatically in frequency and intensity. More importantly, she found an unshakable center within herself. Then there's Christopher, a physician who became disillusioned with medicine's limitations. He witnessed too many patients who received perfect medical treatment yet remained sick, while others with poor prognoses mysteriously healed. He began exploring Joel Goldsmith's spiritual healing principles alongside his medical practice. Christopher started teaching his willing patients about consciousness and fulfillment. He'd explain that medical treatment addresses the body, but consciousness addresses the source. He encouraged them to recognize wholeness in their spiritual identity while receiving appropriate medical care. He never asked anyone to reject medicine, but to complement it with spiritual awareness. The results over 2 years were remarkable. Patients who engaged with both approaches showed measurably better outcomes. Their recovery times shortened, complications decreased, and their overall well-being improved. Christopher realized he was witnessing what Joel taught, that spiritual recognition doesn't replace practical action, but empowers it by changing the consciousness from which action arises. These stories illustrate something crucial that Joel Goldsmith emphasized throughout his teaching. The principle of all is fulfilled in me isn't about magical thinking or denying practical reality. It's about discovering the source of all good in consciousness itself, then allowing that consciousness to express through your practical actions and daily life. The transformation happens gradually as you practice recognition consistently. You won't suddenly become perfect or problem-free, but you'll find yourself increasingly anchored in something unchangeable within you. You'll notice that solutions appear more naturally, that you respond to challenges with greater wisdom, and that your overall experience of life shifts from seeking to recognizing. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore your own fulfilled consciousness, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's wisdom, subscribe for more mystical Christian teachings, and comment which story resonated most deeply with your own spiritual journey right now. Now let me share the complementary practices Joel Goldsmith taught to deepen your recognition of all is fulfilled in me. The first is what he called spiritual listening. This isn't listening for words or messages from God. It's resting in consciousness with an awareness that truth is already present, waiting to be recognized rather than received from outside. Here's how you practice this. Find a quiet moment and close your eyes. Instead of speaking prayers or making requests, simply rest in silence. Hold the awareness that infinite intelligence already knows everything about your situation. Your only task is to be still and receptive. Don't seek an answer. Recognize that the answer already exists in consciousness. When you practice this regularly, you'll notice something remarkable. Insights emerge naturally without effort. You'll suddenly understand things you couldn't grasp before. Solutions appear in your awareness without struggle. This happens because you're not creating anything new, but rather removing the mental static that blocks recognition of what's already present in your spiritual consciousness. The second technique Joel taught is impersonalization. This means recognizing that problems don't actually belong to your true spiritual identity. When you believe, I am sick, or I am poor, or I am anxious, you're identifying your eternal consciousness with temporary human conditions. This identification gives power to the problem. Instead, practice seeing challenges as impersonal appearances that don't touch your true nature. When anxiety appears, recognize anxiety is appearing in experience, but it isn't my spiritual identity. When lack appears, know limitation is a temporary appearance, but infinite abundance is fulfilled in my consciousness. This distinction is absolutely crucial. Joel discovered this principle transformed his healing work. When people came to him with diseases, he didn't see them as sick individuals needing healing. He recognized their true spiritual identity as already whole and complete. The disease was just an impersonal appearance passing through experience. This recognition in his consciousness often triggered healing in theirs. The third practice is what Joel called living by grace. This means developing the consciousness that you don't live by your personal efforts, strategies, or manipulations. You live by the grace that flows naturally from recognizing your fulfilled spiritual identity. Grace is the effortless provision that appears when you stop striving from a sense of lack. Here's the practical application. Before making decisions or taking action, pause and recognize, I am not the source of my good. The infinite consciousness I am is my source, and it contains everything needed. Then take whatever action feels natural, but from this consciousness of already having, rather than desperately needing. This doesn't make you passive or irresponsible. Actually, you often find yourself taking more inspired action. But the action comes from overflow rather than emptiness. You work from fulfillment rather than fear. You create from joy rather than desperation. The external actions may look similar, but the consciousness behind them transforms everything about their effectiveness and your experience. The fourth technique Joel emphasized is releasing human judgment. Most suffering comes from judging appearances as good or bad, then trying to get rid of bad ones and hold on to good ones. But spiritual consciousness sees through appearances to the underlying wholeness. It recognizes that what looks like limitation is often inviting you to discover deeper fulfillment. Practice this by catching yourself in judgment and asking, what if this appearance is an opportunity to recognize a deeper truth? Don't force yourself to be positive about genuinely difficult situations. Just remain open to the possibility that spiritual fulfillment can be recognized even in challenging circumstances. This openness itself becomes transformational. When you combine these four practices with the foundational recognition that all is fulfilled in me, you create a consciousness that Joel called Christ consciousness. Not the historical Jesus, but the awareness of spiritual identity that Jesus demonstrated. This consciousness is already in you, already complete, already fulfilled. Your spiritual work is simply removing the barriers to recognizing it. Let's address the real challenges you'll face when practicing this principle, because Joel Goldsmith was honest about the obstacles. The biggest one is what he called the testimony of the senses. Your physical senses constantly report limitation, lack, and problems. Your bank account shows a specific number. Your body shows symptoms. Your relationships show conflict. These appearances feel absolutely real. Here's what Joel taught about this challenge. You're not denying what your senses report. You're simply recognizing that sensory evidence isn't the deepest truth. Consciousness is prior to form. Spiritual reality precedes physical manifestation. When you recognize fulfillment in consciousness first, the outer forms gradually begin to reflect that inner recognition. But this takes time and consistent practice. The mistake most people make is expecting instant results, then abandoning the practice when circumstances don't immediately change. Joel emphasized, you're reconditioning years or decades of consciousness programmed with lack and limitation. Be patient with yourself. Recognize truth consistently, even when appearances contradict it. The transformation happens through persistence, not perfection. The second major challenge is what Joel called taking thought. This means trying to mentally figure out how your good will appear. You recognize all is fulfilled in me, but then your mind immediately jumps to analyzing and planning exactly how that fulfillment will manifest. This mental activity actually blocks the natural flow of spiritual good. Joel discovered that spiritual demonstration happens through paths you cannot predict or control. When you hold a rigid mental picture of how things should work out, you close yourself to the infinite ways consciousness might express. Your job is recognition and receptivity, not manipulation and control. This requires deep trust. Practice catching yourself in taking thought mode. Notice when your mind starts obsessing about the how and when. Gently return to simple recognition. The infinite knows the way. All is fulfilled in consciousness. I rest in this truth. This rest is active spiritually, even though it feels passive mentally. You're allowing consciousness to work, rather than forcing human will. The third obstacle is inconsistency. You'll have moments of clear recognition where you feel the truth of all is fulfilled in me deeply. Then life challenges hit, and you immediately forget everything. You react from fear, seek frantically for external solutions, and abandon your spiritual awareness. Joel said this is completely normal, especially in the beginning. The key is what he called practicing the presence. This means bringing yourself back to recognition multiple times throughout each day, not just in meditation or prayer time. Set reminders on your phone. Create visual cues in your environment. Use transitions between activities as triggers to pause and recognize fulfillment. Gradually, this awareness becomes more constant. Don't judge yourself harshly when you forget. Joel emphasized that spiritual growth isn't about being perfect, but about being persistent. Each time you catch yourself in fear and return to recognition, you're strengthening the new consciousness. Over months and years, you'll find yourself naturally resting in this awareness more consistently, even during challenges. The fourth challenge Joel addressed is dealing with other people's consciousness. You might be recognizing fulfillment, but people around you are operating from lack, fear, and limitation. Their consciousness can affect your experience, especially if you're emotionally close to them. This is why Joel taught about spiritual protection, not as a defense, but as clarity. Your spiritual practice must include recognizing that other people's beliefs cannot affect your true consciousness. Their fear, judgment, or negativity is their experience, not yours. You remain anchored in the recognition of all is fulfilled in me, regardless of the mental climate around you. This isn't cold or uncaring, it's spiritually intelligent. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart and you're ready to move through obstacles, like to support transformational content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith practices, and comment which obstacle you're most committed to transforming through recognition right now. Now let me show you how this principle operates in advanced scenarios that test everything. Consider Amanda, a single mother facing homelessness after losing her job. Traditional advice would focus entirely on job searching, government assistance, and family help. These practical steps are important, but Amanda also worked with the spiritual principle Joel taught. Every morning before job searching, Amanda spent 20 minutes in recognition. She didn't beg God for a job. She recognized, infinite intelligence is fulfilled in my consciousness. The perfect provision already exists. I am guided to recognize it. Then she took practical actions, but from a consciousness of already having, rather than desperately needing what she lacked. Within 6 weeks, something unexpected happened. A former colleague reached out randomly, mentioning a position that hadn't been advertised yet. Amanda got the interview and then the job. But more importantly, she discovered a spiritual principle that sustained her beyond that crisis. She learned to recognize fulfillment in consciousness before seeing it in form, and this awareness transformed her entire approach to life's challenges. Then there's Kenneth, diagnosed with a serious illness that conventional medicine said was progressive and incurable. Kenneth continued appropriate medical care, but also applied Joel's teaching about consciousness and healing. He didn't deny his diagnosis or reject treatment. He simply refused to accept it as his spiritual identity. Kenneth practiced recognizing, perfect life is fulfilled in my consciousness right now. This diagnosis is a physical appearance, not my spiritual reality. He did this alongside medical appointments, treatments, and lifestyle changes. He wasn't choosing between medicine and spirituality, but integrating both from a consciousness of wholeness rather than disease. Over 18 months, Kenneth's condition stabilized and then gradually improved. His doctors were surprised but attributed it to the treatment working better than expected. Kenneth knew something else was operating. He'd discovered what Joel taught, that consciousness precedes form, and when you consistently recognize wholeness in consciousness, the body eventually reflects that recognition. This doesn't always happen, but it happens far more often than conventional thinking allows. Consider Brian, a therapist who integrated Joel's principles into his professional practice. He worked with clients suffering severe trauma, addiction, and mental health crises. Traditional therapy helped, but Brian found that adding spiritual recognition accelerated transformation in ways that surprised him. Brian would silently recognize his clients' spiritual wholeness while they described their problems. He wasn't denying their suffering or minimizing their pain. He was holding an awareness that beneath all the trauma and dysfunction lived an untouched spiritual identity that was already fulfilled. His consciousness of their wholeness often helped them recognize it themselves. Clients frequently reported that sessions with Brian felt different than other therapy. They felt seen at a deeper level, not just as broken people needing fixing. This recognition created space for healing that went beyond technique. Brian discovered what Joel taught, that recognizing spiritual fulfillment in yourself and others creates an atmosphere where transformation happens naturally. Finally, there's Dorothy, who faced a situation many would consider hopeless. Her adult son struggled with severe addiction, had been through multiple rehabilitation programs, and nothing worked. Dorothy had tried everything: intervention, tough love, enabling, pleading, and prayer. She was emotionally and spiritually exhausted from years of heartbreak and disappointment. When Dorothy learned Joel's teaching, she realized she'd been seeing her son only as his addiction, only as the problem. She began practicing recognition differently. Instead of praying for God to fix him, she recognized his spiritual identity as already whole and free. She stopped trying to change him and started holding awareness of his true consciousness. This didn't instantly cure his addiction, but something shifted in their relationship and in him. Over 2 years, he found his own path to recovery. Dorothy couldn't prove her recognition caused his healing, but she knew her consciousness had changed. She found peace regardless of his choices, and somehow that shift in her consciousness seemed to open space for transformation in his. Now let's bring this teaching to its ultimate conclusion. The recognition that all is fulfilled in me isn't just a technique for solving problems. It's the discovery of your true spiritual identity. Joel Goldsmith taught that you aren't a human being seeking spiritual experiences. You are spiritual consciousness having a temporary human experience. This reversal changes everything. When you live from this recognition consistently, practical life becomes an expression of consciousness rather than a desperate search for fulfillment. You still work, plan, and take action in the world, but you work from fullness rather than emptiness. You create from joy rather than fear. You give from overflow rather than depletion. This is what Jesus demonstrated throughout his ministry. The ultimate freedom Joel discovered is that nothing external can add to or take from your spiritual fulfillment. Success doesn't make you more whole. Failure doesn't make you less complete. Health doesn't increase your spiritual perfection. Illness doesn't diminish your true identity. This recognition liberates you from the tyranny of circumstances controlling your peace. Here's what this looks like practically in daily life. You wake up and before checking your phone or thinking about your day, you pause and recognize, I am the fulfilled consciousness. Everything I need is already present. This takes 30 seconds but sets the foundation for your entire day. You're not creating fulfillment. You're acknowledging what's already true. Throughout your day, you face challenges, disappointments, surprises, and opportunities. Instead of reacting from fear or grasping from lack, you pause repeatedly and return to recognition. All is fulfilled in me. This doesn't solve every problem instantly, but it keeps you anchored in spiritual awareness while you handle practical matters intelligently. At night, you review your day not with judgment, but with recognition. You acknowledge where you remembered truth and where you forgot. You don't condemn yourself for forgetting. You simply recognize again. All is fulfilled in me right now, regardless of today's experiences. This consistent practice gradually transforms your consciousness from seeking to recognizing, from lacking to resting, from striving to being. Joel Goldsmith discovered something that few spiritual teachers understood so clearly. The consciousness of fulfillment attracts fulfillment in form, not through magical thinking or manipulation, but through spiritual law. When you consistently recognize abundance in consciousness, abundance appears in experience. When you acknowledge wholeness within, healing manifests outwardly. When you rest in peace internally, circumstances gradually align with that peace. This isn't instant or guaranteed in specific forms. You might recognize financial abundance in consciousness, and it could appear as a job, an unexpected gift, a business opportunity, or reduced expenses. You don't control the form. You recognize the consciousness. The infinite intelligence that fulfills itself in you knows the perfect way to manifest in your specific situation. The key is releasing attachment to specific outcomes while remaining anchored in recognition of fulfillment. This is the spiritual maturity Jesus demonstrated. He didn't demand things happen in a particular way. He recognized the Father's fulfillment in consciousness and allowed it to express through whatever form was perfect. This same spiritual intelligence is available to you right now. So here's your invitation into the life Jesus demonstrated and Joel Goldsmith taught. Stop seeking fulfillment in external circumstances, achievements, relationships, or possessions. Start recognizing that all is already fulfilled in your spiritual consciousness. This isn't denying practical reality or rejecting appropriate action. It's discovering the source of all good within yourself. Practice this recognition consistently. When you wake, throughout your day, when facing challenges, before sleeping. All is fulfilled in me. Not as a magical incantation, but as a recognition of spiritual truth. Let this awareness gradually restructure your consciousness from seeking to acknowledging, from lacking to recognizing, from striving to resting in what already is. Your life will transform, not because you're trying to make things happen, but because you're removing the barriers to recognizing what's already present. Joel spent his life teaching this one principle in countless ways. You are the fulfilled consciousness of God expressing as individual being. Everything you seek is already present within you, waiting only to be recognized. This is what Jesus meant by, all is fulfilled in me, and it's your spiritual inheritance right now. If your understanding of spiritual fulfillment expanded through these Joel Goldsmith teachings, like this video to help others discover this consciousness, subscribe for more transformative mystical Christian wisdom, and comment, all is fulfilled in me, to confirm your recognition of this truth. When Jesus said, ask and you shall receive, he was not talking about begging an external God for favors. He was revealing the most profound spiritual law that Joel Goldsmith spent decades helping people understand. This teaching has been misinterpreted for centuries, causing millions to pray ineffectively and wonder why their prayers go unanswered. The secret lies not in the asking itself, but in understanding what you are asking and who is doing the asking. Joel discovered that most people are asking from a consciousness of lack, fear, and separation. They are asking something outside themselves to fix their problems. This is why their prayers feel empty and produce no real change. True asking, as Jesus taught it, is a recognition of what already exists in spiritual reality. You are not begging for something you do not have. You are opening your awareness to receive what has always been present in divine consciousness. This distinction changes everything about how prayer works and why it succeeds or fails. When you grasp this principle completely, your entire relationship with the divine transforms. You stop being a beggar and become a receiver of infinite good that flows naturally when consciousness is properly aligned. Joel Goldsmith taught that the kingdom of God is within you, not somewhere in the distant heavens. This means everything you could ever need or desire already exists in your own consciousness. The asking Jesus spoke of is actually an inner turning, a shift in awareness from the material sense of limitation to the spiritual sense of wholeness. Most people ask from the level of the problem. They focus on what is wrong, what is missing, what hurts. This keeps consciousness locked in the very frequency that created the problem in the first place. Joel showed that effective spiritual work begins by rising above the problem into the consciousness where the solution already exists. Imagine asking while already knowing the answer is yes, not hoping, not wishing, but knowing with absolute certainty. This is the consciousness of true asking. It is not petition, but recognition. It is not begging, but claiming what spiritually belongs to you as a child of the infinite. The moment you understand this shift, you stop praying for things to change and start recognizing the spiritual perfection that is already present. This is when miracles become natural and receiving becomes effortless. Joel discovered through years of spiritual practice that asking is actually a form of listening. When you ask correctly, you are not sending requests outward. You are becoming still enough to hear the answer that divine intelligence is already speaking. The answer precedes the question in spiritual reality. Think of it like tuning a radio. The music is already broadcasting on every frequency. When you ask, you are adjusting your inner dial to receive what is already being transmitted. Most people are asking on the wrong frequency, expecting to hear classical music while tuned to static. This is why Joel emphasized contemplative meditation over petitionary prayer. In the silence, when your human mind becomes quiet, the divine reality can impress itself upon your awareness. You begin to receive not through mental effort, but through spiritual receptivity. The asking becomes an opening rather than a demanding. Your consciousness is the receiving station for infinite intelligence. When it is clear, still, and aligned with spiritual truth, the answers flow naturally. Problems dissolve not because you force change, but because you perceive the reality that was always present beneath the illusion. The reason most asking fails is because people are asking from the separated self, the ego that believes it is cut off from God and must convince a reluctant deity to provide. Joel taught that this consciousness cannot receive because it is founded on the lie of separation. God is not separate from you, withholding good until you ask correctly enough. True asking recognizes your oneness with infinite source. You're not separate from the supply you seek. The intelligence, health, abundance, and love you desire are not outside you waiting to be granted. They are the very nature of the consciousness you are made of when you remember who you truly are. Jesus said the Father knows what you need before you ask. This means the divine is already providing, already answering, already supplying everything necessary for your wholeness. Your role is not to inform God of your problems, but to align your awareness with the divine provision that never stops flowing. When you ask from this consciousness of oneness, you're not asking for something to be created. You're accepting what already is. This is the secret that transforms prayer from struggle into grace, from effort into receiving, from begging into claiming your spiritual inheritance. Helen was a woman who had prayed for financial breakthrough for 3 years with no results. She attended every prayer meeting, repeated affirmations daily, and believed she was doing everything right. Yet her bank account remained empty and opportunities seemed to pass her by. She was exhausted from asking and ready to give up on spiritual principles entirely. When Helen encountered Joel Goldsmith's teachings, everything shifted. She learned she had been asking from lack consciousness, constantly affirming her need and poverty. Every prayer reinforced the very condition she wanted to escape. Joel taught her to stop asking for money and start recognizing the infinite substance that is the true nature of reality. For 2 months, Helen practiced contemplative meditation, not asking for anything but simply resting in the awareness of divine completeness. She stopped tracking her bank balance obsessively. She stopped panicking about bills. She started each day recognizing that infinite intelligence was already providing everything necessary for her well-being. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Within 3 months, Helen received an unexpected job offer with triple her previous salary. A forgotten investment matured with surprising returns. Opportunities appeared that had always been there, but she had been too anxious to notice. She learned that asking is not begging, but opening to receive. Marcus had suffered from chronic pain for 7 years. He had prayed desperately for healing, visited countless healers, and tried every spiritual technique he could find. Each time the pain returned, his faith diminished. He began to believe either God did not care, or that he was somehow unworthy of healing. Joel Goldsmith's principle changed Marcus's entire approach. He realized he had been asking God to fix a material body, which kept his consciousness locked in the belief that something was wrong. Joel taught that true healing happens when you rise above the material sense into spiritual reality where perfection is already established. Marcus stopped praying for his pain to go away. Instead, he spent time each day recognizing the spiritual body that knows no disease, age, or limitation. He did not deny the pain when it appeared, but he refused to give it power through constant attention. He practiced turning from the problem to the presence of divine wholeness within. Over 6 months, the pain episodes decreased in frequency and intensity. More importantly, Marcus's fear of the pain dissolved. He discovered an inner peace that remained stable, regardless of physical sensations. A year later, the chronic condition had completely resolved. The healing came not from asking for relief, but from recognizing the spiritual perfection that was always his true nature. Victoria had been asking for the right relationship for over a decade. She had created vision boards, done affirmations, and prayed with intensity. Yet every relationship either never materialized or ended in disappointment. She felt cursed and wondered if she was meant to be alone forever. Her prayers felt like they were hitting a ceiling and bouncing back. When Victoria studied Joel's teachings on consciousness, she understood her mistake. She had been asking from loneliness and desperation, which could only attract more experiences of lack. Joel taught that you cannot receive from consciousness what is not already in consciousness. Her awareness was saturated with the belief that she was incomplete without a partner. Victoria began a different practice. Instead of asking for someone to complete her, she spent months recognizing her own spiritual wholeness. She stopped searching desperately and started living fully from her current completeness. She practiced feeling the love she sought, knowing that love is not something you get from another person, but something you are. Within 8 months of this shift, Victoria met Jonathan at a community event she attended simply for joy, not hunting for partners. The relationship unfolded naturally, built on 2 whole people choosing to share rather than 2 incomplete people needing to merge. She learned that asking is not about getting what you lack, but recognizing what you already are. Gregory was a businessman facing bankruptcy. His company was failing, creditors were demanding payment, and his family's security was threatened. He had prayed intensely for a miracle, for God to intervene and save his business. Each day without rescue deepened his panic and sense of abandonment. He felt his prayers were useless. Joel Goldsmith's teaching reached Gregory at his lowest point. He learned that his frantic prayers were actually reinforcing his crisis consciousness. Every desperate ask was an affirmation of disaster. Joel taught him to cease mental struggling and enter the silence where divine intelligence could guide him beyond human reasoning. Gregory practiced contemplative stillness twice daily for 3 months, not asking for solutions but opening to wisdom beyond his limited perspective. He stopped forcing outcomes and started listening for guidance. Gradually, clarity emerged. He saw business restructuring possibilities he had overlooked. He made decisions from peace rather than panic. The business did not save itself overnight. Some painful changes were necessary, but within a year, Gregory had restructured successfully and discovered a more sustainable business model. The transformation came not from asking God to preserve what was failing, but from receiving the wisdom that could create something better. He learned that divine provision often looks different than human expectation. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment which healing journey resonated most with you. Joel Goldsmith taught a complementary practice he called resting in the Word. This technique works alongside proper asking to deepen your receptivity. When you have a question or need, instead of repeatedly asking about it, you select a spiritual truth that addresses the consciousness behind the problem. You rest in that truth like marinating in divine reality. For example, if you are asking about financial supply, you might rest in the word that God is infinite abundance, and you are the expression of that abundance. You do not repeat this mechanically like an affirmation. You sit with it, let it unfold in your awareness. Feel its truth resonating in your consciousness until it becomes real to you. This practice prevents the asking from becoming anxious repetition. Instead of bombarding heaven with requests, you ask once with clarity, then rest in the spiritual truth that addresses the situation. The resting is where the transformation happens. Your consciousness absorbs the truth like soil absorbing rain. Joel discovered that problems persist, not because God is slow to answer, but because consciousness remains unchanged. When you rest in spiritual truth daily, your consciousness gradually shifts from problem awareness to solution awareness. The outer circumstances then reorganize to match your transformed inner state. Another powerful technique Joel taught is the practice of impersonal prayer. Most asking is intensely personal, focused on me and my problems, my needs, my desires. This personal focus actually limits what can be received Because it keeps consciousness small and self-centered. Impersonal prayer expands your awareness beyond personal concerns. In impersonal prayer, you recognize spiritual principles that are true for everyone everywhere. You do not ask for your healing, but recognize that healing is the nature of divine reality for all. You do not ask for your supply, but acknowledge that infinite abundance is the truth of existence itself, flowing to all who are open. This practice seems counterintuitive. How can asking for everyone help me specifically? Joel discovered that when you pray impersonally, you rise into universal consciousness where all good is already established. From that elevated awareness, your personal experience automatically reflects the universal truth you have recognized. Try this practice. When you have a need, instead of asking for yourself, spend time recognizing the spiritual truth behind the need as a universal principle. Acknowledge that divine intelligence governs all, supplies all, heals all. As you rest in this impersonal truth, you will find your personal situation transforming without the struggle of focused personal asking. Joel also taught the practice of releasing mental pictures. When you ask, your human mind immediately creates pictures of how the answer should look, when it should arrive, and what form it should take. These mental pictures become barriers that prevent you from receiving what divine intelligence is actually providing, which is often far beyond what your limited mind could imagine. True asking includes releasing your attachment to specific outcomes. You present your need or question to divine consciousness, then step back and remain open to how the answer appears. The universe has infinite ways to provide what you need, but if you are demanding one specific path, you close yourself to all other possibilities. This does not mean you have no preferences or desires. It means you hold your preferences lightly, willing to receive something better than you could conceive. Joel often said that divine supply comes in forms we do not expect through channels we did not anticipate. Your mental pictures limit the infinite to your finite imagination. Practice asking with an open hand rather than a clenched fist. State your need or question clearly, then add silently, "This or something better for the highest good." Release your grip on how it must happen. Trust that intelligence greater than your human reasoning is already arranging the perfect provision. The final complementary technique is what Joel called living by grace. This means shifting from asking God to do things to recognizing that God is already being all, doing all, and providing all. You stop trying to get God to act and start acknowledging the divine action that never ceases. This is the difference between effortful asking and receptive allowing. Living by grace means you go through your day aware that infinite intelligence is governing every situation. You do not have to make everything happen through your human effort. You do your part with wisdom and diligence, but you trust that there is a divine component working through and beyond your efforts to produce results you could not achieve alone. When challenges arise, instead of asking God to fix them, you pause and recognize that divine intelligence is already present in this situation, with wisdom beyond your understanding. You ask not for intervention, but for the awareness to perceive the spiritual reality that already contains the solution. This subtle shift transforms struggle into cooperation with grace. Joel lived this way consistently. He did not frantically ask for guidance before every decision. He lived in a consciousness of oneness with divine intelligence, trusting that he would know what to do when action was required. This is the ultimate fruit of understanding true asking. You rest in continuous communion rather than periodic petition. One of the most common challenges people face when learning this approach to asking is impatience. You practice for a few days or weeks, and when dramatic results do not appear immediately, you conclude the teaching does not work and return to old patterns. This is where most people abandon the practice just before the consciousness shift would have manifested visible results. Joel consistently taught that consciousness transformation takes time. You are not just trying a new technique. You are undoing years or decades of conditioned thinking, fear patterns, and belief in separation. The old consciousness does not dissolve overnight. It requires patient, persistent practice to establish a new foundation of awareness. The key is consistency, without anxiety about timing. Practice your contemplative meditation daily, not because you must see results today, but because you are cultivating spiritual awareness as a way of life. Some people experience rapid transformation, Others need months of practice before visible changes occur. Neither timeline reflects your worthiness or the truth of the principle. Trust the process, even when physical evidence lags behind your practice. The consciousness shift is happening in the invisible realm first. Continue your daily practice of resting in spiritual truth, releasing mental pictures, and recognizing divine presence. The outer results will appear when the inner foundation is sufficiently established. Another significant challenge is the tendency to return to old patterns during crisis. You practice beautifully when life is calm, but the moment serious trouble hits, panic takes over, and you forget everything you learned. You revert to desperate begging, anxious mental struggling, and frantic human effort. This is completely normal and does not mean you have failed. Joel himself experienced this in his early years of practice. During intense difficulty, the temptation to abandon spiritual principles and resort to human panic is almost overwhelming. The key is not to judge yourself harshly when this happens, but to gently return to the practice as soon as you recognize what occurred. Build your spiritual consciousness during peaceful times so it becomes strong enough to sustain you during storms. This is why daily practice matters even when you have no pressing needs. You are establishing an inner foundation that will hold steady when external circumstances become turbulent. The practice during easy times prepares you for difficult times. When you catch yourself reverting to panic and desperate asking, simply pause. Take a breath. Remind yourself of what you know. Return to the silence. Recognize divine presence even in the midst of the crisis. Each time you do this, you strengthen your ability to maintain spiritual consciousness regardless of external conditions. A third challenge is dealing with doubt when you see others experiencing rapid results while your progress seems slower. Comparison becomes a thief of faith. You wonder if something is wrong with you, if you are practicing incorrectly, or if the teaching works for everyone except you. This doubt can undermine your practice completely. Joel addressed this directly in his writings. Every consciousness is unique, carrying different layers of conditioning, different belief patterns, and different levels of spiritual readiness. Some people are prepared by life circumstances to receive truth quickly. Others need more time to dissolve the barriers their experience has created. Neither is better or worse. Your spiritual journey is yours alone. Comparing your progress to another person's experience is meaningless because you are not working with the same consciousness. What matters is whether you are moving forward from where you were, not whether you are matching someone else's pace. Growth is growth regardless of speed. Focus on your own unfolding. Celebrate the small shifts in your awareness, the moments of peace that last longer, the problems that resolve more easily. These are evidence that consciousness is transforming. Trust your unique timing and refuse to let comparison steal your confidence in the process. The fourth major challenge is maintaining practice when results appear to contradict spiritual truth. You practice recognizing health consciousness, and the symptoms worsen. You recognize abundance and lose your job. The human mind interprets this as evidence that spiritual principles do not work. This is a critical point where many abandon the practice. Joel taught that appearances often intensify before they dissolve. This is not because spiritual practice makes things worse, but because your increased awareness sees more clearly what was always there. Additionally, sometimes what appears as worsening is actually a necessary reorganization that precedes breakthrough. The caterpillar must dissolve before becoming a butterfly. This is where faith in spiritual reality over material appearance becomes essential. You must decide whether consciousness or conditions are primary. If consciousness is truly creative, then changing consciousness must eventually change conditions, even when appearances temporarily suggest otherwise. Hold steady through the contradictory evidence. Joel's own healing work involved many cases where symptoms initially intensified during spiritual treatment before complete healing occurred. He learned not to judge by appearances but to remain faithful to spiritual truth, regardless of what the senses reported. This steadfastness is what allows transformation to complete itself. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Sophia was an advanced spiritual student who understood Joel's teachings intellectually, but struggled to live them during ordinary daily life. She could reach beautiful states of consciousness during meditation, but returned to fear and struggle the moment she opened her eyes. She asked how to bridge the gap between meditation and daily living. Joel's answer was to practice moment-by-moment awareness. Do not separate your spiritual practice from your daily activities. As you go through routine tasks, washing dishes, driving, working, practice recognizing divine presence in each moment. Ask not just during meditation, but continuously throughout your day by maintaining awareness of spiritual reality. Sophia began practicing what Joel called practicing the presence. Before each activity, she would pause briefly to recognize that divine intelligence was present and active. She stopped dividing her life into sacred meditation time and secular activity time. Everything became spiritual practice. Every moment was an opportunity to ask and receive by being aware. Over many months, the gap between meditation and life gradually closed. Sophia found herself naturally responding from spiritual consciousness during challenges without having to stop and meditate first. The consciousness she touched in silence became her living awareness. This is the advanced stage where asking becomes your natural state of being. Benjamin faced an advanced challenge: how to practice when surrounded by people who do not understand or support spiritual principles. His family mocked his meditation practice. His colleagues considered his beliefs naive. He felt isolated and wondered if he could maintain his practice in an unsupportive environment. Joel taught that spiritual consciousness does not require external validation or support. Your practice is between you and divine reality, not between you and the opinions of others. In fact, maintaining your awareness despite opposition strengthens your consciousness far more than practicing in a supportive bubble. Benjamin learned to practice silently without announcing his beliefs to everyone. He maintained his morning meditation and inner awareness throughout the day without needing others to understand or approve. He discovered that spiritual consciousness does not need to be defended or explained. It simply needs to be lived. Gradually, Benjamin's consistent practice produced visible fruit in his life. His peace during stress, his wisdom in decisions, and his ability to remain centered when others panicked spoke louder than any words. Some family members began asking questions. His example became more effective than any argument could have been. Claire encountered an advanced dilemma. She had been practicing Joel's principles successfully for years when suddenly she experienced a major setback that seemed to contradict everything she had learned. A serious illness appeared despite her consistent spiritual practice. She felt betrayed by principles she had trusted completely. Joel addressed this situation in his advanced teachings. Spiritual practice does not create a magical shield against all human experience. Even spiritually aware people can face challenges that appear to contradict their level of consciousness. The difference is not in avoiding all problems, but in how you move through them. Claire returned to the basics. Instead of asking why this happened to her after faithful practice, she asked how to remain spiritually aware within this situation. She did not pretend the illness was not real. She sought medical help when appropriate, but she refused to let the condition define her identity or destroy her awareness of spiritual wholeness. Through months of patient practice, Claire experienced healing, but more importantly, she discovered a deeper level of consciousness. She learned that spiritual maturity is not about never facing challenges, but about maintaining your awareness of divine presence regardless of circumstances. The illness became her teacher rather than her enemy. Edward was a healer who had helped many people through Joel's principles but struggled when asked to help his own seriously ill child. All the consciousness techniques he had used successfully with others seemed powerless when his beloved daughter was suffering. His desperation to fix the situation blocked his ability to rest in spiritual truth. Joel taught that personal attachment is often the greatest barrier to effective spiritual work. When you are emotionally desperate for a specific outcome, you cannot rest in the openness that allows divine intelligence to work. Edward needed to practice surrendering his daughter into divine care rather than trying to force healing through anxious spiritual effort. This was the hardest practice Edward ever faced. He had to release his grip on demanding that his daughter be healed exactly as he envisioned. He practiced recognizing her spiritual perfection while simultaneously being present to her human experience without denial. He learned to trust divine intelligence more than his own desperate efforts. The daughter's healing unfolded gradually over many months, not in the dramatic way Edward had demanded, but in the perfect way that divine wisdom provided. Edward learned that true asking includes surrendering your loved ones into care greater than your human love, trusting that infinite intelligence loves them even more perfectly than you do. When you truly understand ask, and you shall receive as Jesus and Joel Goldsmith taught it, your entire relationship with life transforms. You stop being a beggar approaching a reluctant deity and become a conscious receiver of infinite good that flows continuously from the source of all being. Prayer becomes communion rather than petition. You discover that asking is not about getting God to change circumstances, but about aligning consciousness with spiritual reality, where all wholeness already exists. Problems do not require divine intervention to fix them. They require spiritual awareness to recognize the perfection that was always present beneath the illusion of limitation. Your daily life becomes a practice of receptivity. You wake each morning aware that divine intelligence is already providing everything necessary for this day. You move through challenges not by frantically asking for rescue, but by recognizing the presence and power already available in every situation. Fear loses its grip because you know you are never separate from infinite source. This does not mean you never face difficulties or experience challenges. It means you face them from a transformed consciousness that knows how to receive divine wisdom, strength, and provision in the midst of any circumstance. You become like a tree planted by streams of water, drawing constantly from a source that never runs dry. The ultimate transformation is discovering that you yourself are the answer to your asking. Not your human personality or limited ego, but the divine consciousness that is your true nature. When Jesus said the kingdom of God is within you, he meant that everything you seek outside yourself is actually the nature of your own being when recognized spiritually. You stop searching for God to give you love when you realize you are made of love itself. You stop asking for abundance when you recognize that infinite substance is the very consciousness you exist within. You stop begging for healing when you understand that spiritual wholeness is your permanent reality regardless of temporary physical appearances. This is what Joel called the mystical experience, the direct awareness that you and the Father are one, not separate beings negotiating terms, but one consciousness expressing itself. From this awareness, asking becomes recognition. Receiving becomes natural. Miracles become the normal experience of consciousness aligned with its true nature. You do not reach this awareness through more effort or more intense asking. You reach it through surrendering the belief in separation, releasing the struggle to become what you already are, and resting in the silence where truth reveals itself. This is the pearl of great price that makes all other treasures worthwhile. Living from this transformed consciousness means you approach each day differently. You do not wake up planning how to make things happen through human effort alone. You wake aware that divine intelligence is already at work in your life, guiding, providing, and unfolding good that you could not orchestrate through personal planning. You make decisions from peace rather than anxiety because you trust that you are not alone in navigating life's choices. You ask for guidance not by begging for signs, but by becoming still enough to hear the wisdom that is always speaking. You recognize answers in unexpected moments, through unlikely sources, in ways your human mind would never have anticipated. You relate to others differently. Instead of manipulating or controlling to get your needs met, you trust that divine intelligence is providing through countless channels, many of which you cannot see or predict. You give freely because you know supply flows from infinite source, not from other people's limited resources. Challenges still arise, but you meet them from a foundation of inner security rather than panic. You know that every problem contains its own solution when viewed from spiritual consciousness. You ask not for problems to disappear, but for the awareness to perceive the spiritual reality that transcends every material limitation. The teaching Jesus gave and Joel Goldsmith clarified transforms everything when truly understood. Ask and you shall receive is not a formula for getting what your human personality wants. It is an invitation to recognize your oneness with infinite intelligence and receive the continuous flow of good that is always available to spiritual awareness. Your practice now is not to perfect your asking technique, but to deepen your awareness of the presence that is closer to you than your own breath. You do not need to ask better. You need to receive what has already been given, to recognize what is already present, to accept what has always been yours in spiritual reality. This journey does not end. It deepens infinitely. Each day brings new opportunities to choose spiritual awareness over material sense, to rest in presence rather than struggle in absence, to receive from fullness rather than beg from lack. You are becoming the expression of infinite consciousness that you were always created to be. Joel Goldsmith spent his life sharing this transformative truth. Now it is yours. Practice it daily. Live it consistently. Watch your entire experience of reality transform as your consciousness awakens to the infinite good that asks only to be recognized and received. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path. Joshua sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen table. His hands trembled as he calculated the numbers for the third time that evening. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around his chest like a vice. He had lost his job 2 months ago, and despite countless applications, nothing had materialized. His phone buzzed with another notification, probably another creditor. Joshua felt his heart race faster. The anxiety had become his constant companion, whispering worst-case scenarios in his mind every waking moment. He wondered how he would survive another week. That night, unable to sleep, Joshua remembered something his grandmother used to say before she passed. She would often quote Jesus saying, "Fear not," and would smile peacefully even during the hardest times. He had never understood how she maintained such calm in the face of difficulty. Desperate for anything that might bring relief, Joshua opened his laptop and searched for the meaning behind those words. He stumbled upon a lecture by Joel Goldsmith about spiritual principles and the true nature of fear. Something about the title caught his attention, and he pressed play. The voice on the recording spoke with unusual authority and gentleness. Goldsmith explained that fear is not something to be fought or suppressed, but understood. Joshua leaned closer to the screen, his interest suddenly awakened despite his exhaustion. Goldsmith's words began to penetrate Joshua's consciousness. The teacher explained that when Jesus repeatedly said, "Fear not," he was not giving a command to simply stop being afraid. He was revealing a profound spiritual truth about the nature of reality itself. According to Goldsmith, Jesus understood that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from the divine source of all life. When we think we must rely solely on our own limited human resources, fear naturally arises. We fear lack, loss, disease, and death because we see ourselves as vulnerable and alone. Joshua paused the recording and sat back in his chair. This perspective was entirely different from anything he had heard in church growing up. He had always thought fear not meant he should try harder to be brave, that his fear was a personal failing or lack of faith. Goldsmith continued, explaining that Jesus lived from a consciousness of oneness with God. From this awareness, he could see that the things humans fear most have no real power. Material circumstances, though they appear threatening, cannot touch the eternal spiritual reality that is our true nature. The teacher's voice grew more emphatic as he described how Jesus performed miracles not through supernatural intervention, but through spiritual understanding. He saw through the illusion of separation and recognized the presence of God where others saw only problems and limitations. Over the following week, Joshua listened to the recording multiple times. Each time, he discovered new layers of meaning. Goldsmith taught that fear is essentially a belief in two powers, God and something else that can harm us. But spiritual truth recognizes only one power, one presence. Joshua began to see how his fear had been rooted in the belief that his well-being depended entirely on external circumstances. His job, his bank account, other people's decisions. These had seemed like the source of his security. When they disappeared, terror filled the vacuum. But Goldsmith pointed to a different foundation. He explained that our true source is the infinite intelligence and love that created the universe. This source does not fluctuate with stock markets or employment trends. It is permanent, unchanging, and always available. The concept felt radical to Joshua. Could it really be true that his security did not depend on having a job or money in the bank? Everything in his practical experience seemed to contradict this idea, yet something deep within him resonated with these words. Goldsmith addressed this exact doubt in his teaching. He acknowledged that spiritual principles seem impractical to the human mind, but he insisted that thousands of people throughout history had proven these truths by experience. When truly understood and lived, they produced tangible results in the material world. Joshua decided to test these principles in a small way. Instead of waking up and immediately diving into panic about his situation, he spent the first hour of each morning in quiet contemplation. He practiced recognizing the presence of divine intelligence within and around him. At first, his mind resisted fiercely. Thoughts of his dwindling bank account and mounting debt would intrude constantly. But he persisted, gently returning his attention to the truth that Goldsmith had illuminated. There is only one power, one source, and it is forever giving of itself. Something unexpected began to happen. The crushing weight of fear that had been his constant companion started to lift, not all at once, but gradually. In moments of quiet awareness, Joshua experienced a peace he had never known, even when his circumstances had been comfortable. This peace was not the absence of challenges or the presence of solutions. It was something deeper, a sense of being held by something vast and loving. Joshua realized this was what his grandmother had possessed, that mysterious calm that no external circumstance could disturb. He remembered Goldsmith explaining that Jesus could sleep peacefully in a boat during a raging storm because he knew the truth about God's presence. The storm was real on one level, but it could not touch the deeper reality of divine order and love. 2 weeks into his daily practice, Joshua received a call from a former colleague named Robert. They had worked together years ago, and Robert had recently started his own consulting firm. He needed someone with Joshua's specific expertise for a major project. The timing seemed miraculous, but Joshua was beginning to understand what Goldsmith taught about divine timing. When we cease blocking the flow of good through fear and anxiety, when we become receptive to divine guidance, opportunities appear that were always there but invisible to our fear-clouded vision. Joshua accepted the project, but something had fundamentally shifted in him. He no longer felt desperate or grasping. The job was welcome, but his sense of security no longer depended on it. He had touched something deeper, more reliable than any external circumstance. As he worked on Robert's project, Joshua noticed he approached challenges differently. Where he once would have panicked at difficulties, he now paused to recognize the presence of infinite intelligence available to guide him. Solutions came more easily, creativity flowed more naturally. Goldsmith had taught that when we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we begin to live from a different consciousness. We stop trying to manipulate circumstances through anxiety and effort. Instead, we align ourselves with the divine flow that is always moving toward greater expression and fulfillment. Robert was so impressed with Joshua's work that he offered him a permanent position as a senior consultant. The salary was higher than his previous job, and the work was more aligned with his passions. But Joshua knew this was not the real miracle. The real miracle was the transformation of his consciousness. He had discovered that his grandmother's peace was not the result of having easy circumstances. It came from understanding a spiritual truth that transcended circumstances. Fear had lost its power over him because he no longer believed in its fundamental premise. Joshua continued his morning practice of recognizing divine presence. Goldsmith had emphasized that spiritual understanding is not a one-time achievement, but a daily practice. Every day we must choose again to see through the illusion of separation and remember the truth of oneness. One morning during his contemplation, Joshua had a profound realization. He saw that every time Jesus said, "Fear not," he was inviting people to share his consciousness, his awareness of God's immediate presence. It was not a command, but an invitation to transformation. This understanding changed everything. Joshua was no longer trying to force himself to stop being afraid while still believing in all the reasons for fear. Instead, he was learning to see differently, to perceive the spiritual reality that exists beyond material appearances. Joshua began sharing his discovery with others who were struggling with fear and anxiety. He spoke carefully, knowing that these principles could sound like impractical mysticism to those who had not experienced their power. But to those who were ready, his words carried the ring of truth. He met Rebecca, a woman in her 40s who was paralyzed by fear of a health diagnosis. She had been told she might have a serious illness and was waiting for test results. The fear was consuming her, making it impossible to function normally or find any peace. Joshua shared what he had learned from Goldsmith about the nature of fear and the meaning of fear not. He explained that Jesus was not telling her to be brave in the face of a real threat. He was revealing that the threat itself exists only in a limited perception of reality. Rebecca struggled to grasp this at first. Her body, the potential illness, the doctors and their tests, all seemed undeniably real and threatening. How could spiritual truth possibly change these concrete facts? Joshua understood her confusion because he had felt the same way. He explained that spiritual understanding does not deny the appearance of problems. Instead, it sees beyond appearances to the underlying reality of divine perfection. When we align our consciousness with this truth, the appearance itself often changes, not through our will but through divine law. Rebecca decided to try Joshua's approach while waiting for her test results. Each morning, instead of spiraling into fear scenarios, she spent time recognizing the presence of perfect life that is God. She acknowledged that her true being was spiritual, eternal, and untouchable by disease. The practice was difficult at first. Her mind kept returning to fear, analyzing symptoms, imagining worst outcomes. But gradually, like Joshua before her, she began to experience moments of profound peace. In these moments, she touched something real, something more substantial than her physical concerns. Goldsmith had taught that this peace is not escape or denial. It is the recognition of what is eternally true. Disease, lack, and danger exist in the realm of material appearance, but they have no existence in spiritual reality. As we dwell in spiritual awareness, material appearances come into alignment with spiritual truth. Rebecca's test results came back negative. There was no serious illness after all. But like Joshua with his job offer, she knew the real healing had already occurred. She had been healed of fear itself, of the belief that her life and well-being were at the mercy of material conditions. She called Joshua to thank him, her voice filled with emotion. She said she finally understood what Jesus meant by fear not. It was not a command to be brave, but a revelation that there is nothing to fear when we understand the true nature of reality and our relationship to God. If this message is resonating with you, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the spiritual insights that can transform your relationship with fear forever. Joshua's consulting work flourished, but he found himself increasingly drawn to share the spiritual principles that had transformed his life. He started a small study group focused on Goldsmith's teachings about fear, faith, and spiritual consciousness. The group met weekly in his apartment. People came from various backgrounds, each carrying their own burden of fear. Some feared financial ruin, others feared loss of loved ones, illness, failure, or loneliness. Despite their different circumstances, Joshua recognized they all suffered from the same fundamental misconception. They believed their well-being depended on external conditions remaining favorable. They believed they were separate from their source, vulnerable and alone in a threatening world. This belief is the root of all fear, and it is precisely what Jesus addressed when he repeatedly said, "Fear not." Joshua guided the group through Goldsmith's teaching systematically. They studied the idea that God is the only power, the only presence, the only life. Where God is, nothing else can be. Fear, disease, lack, and danger cannot exist in the presence of infinite good. At first, this sounded like positive thinking or wishful denial to some group members. But Joshua emphasized that Goldsmith was not teaching affirmations or mental manipulation. He was pointing to an actual spiritual reality that exists whether we acknowledge it or not. A man named Christopher joined the group, bringing a particularly challenging situation. His teenage daughter had fallen into drug addiction, and despite multiple attempts at rehabilitation, she continued to relapse. Christopher's fear for her life was overwhelming and entirely understandable. He listened to the discussions about fear with barely concealed frustration. How could spiritual principles help when his daughter's life was genuinely at risk? This was not abstract philosophy, but a real emergency requiring real action. Joshua recognized the legitimacy of Christopher's concern. But Joshua also knew that fear itself was preventing Christopher from being truly helpful to his daughter. His terror kept him reactive, controlling, and unable to see clearly. Moreover, his fear was actually an unconscious agreement with the power of addiction, affirming its reality and strength. Goldsmith taught that to truly help anyone, we must first establish ourselves in spiritual truth. We must see beyond the appearance of the problem to the spiritual perfection that is always present. This is not denial, but the highest form of practical help we can offer. Christopher was skeptical but desperate enough to try anything. Joshua suggested he spend time each day recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity. Not the addict, not the troubled teenager, but the eternal spiritual being created in the image and likeness of God. Christopher committed to the practice, though doubt plagued him constantly. He would sit in meditation and try to see his daughter as God saw her, whole, perfect, and free. His human mind screamed that this was nonsense, that he was wasting time while she remained in danger. But gradually something shifted in Christopher's consciousness. He began to experience a deep peace about his daughter, not because circumstances had changed, but because he had touched something eternal and unchangeable. He sensed her true being beneath the troubled surface appearance. This inner shift affected his interactions with his daughter profoundly. He stopped approaching her with fear and desperation. Instead, he related to her from a place of calm certainty about her fundamental goodness and worth. He no longer saw her as broken or damaged, but as temporarily confused about her true identity. His daughter noticed the change in her father immediately. The fear and disappointment she had always sensed in him had disappeared. In its place was something she had never experienced from him before, an unshakable confidence in her despite all evidence to the contrary. Goldsmith explained that this is how spiritual healing works. When we stop empowering the problem through fear and see only the spiritual reality, we create an atmosphere in which healing can occur. We are not trying to change the person or condition, but recognizing what is eternally true. Over the following months, Christopher's daughter gradually turned away from drugs. It was not a sudden miracle, but a steady transformation. She later told her father that his change had been crucial. When he stopped being afraid for her, she stopped believing she was someone to be afraid of. The study group grew as people experienced the power of these principles in their own lives. Joshua realized that understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," was perhaps the most practical spiritual knowledge anyone could possess. It was not abstract theology, but a key to transformation in every area of life. He continued to study Goldsmith's works more deeply, discovering that this teacher had spent his entire life helping people understand the nature of spiritual consciousness. Goldsmith had experienced his own profound transformation and dedicated himself to sharing these truths with others. One teaching particularly struck Joshua. Goldsmith explained that Jesus never fought evil, disease, or lack. He simply failed to recognize them as real powers. He saw only God, only good, only spiritual perfection. This singular vision was the source of his power and peace. This was revolutionary for Joshua. He had spent his whole life fighting his fears, trying to overcome them through willpower or positive thinking. But Goldsmith taught a different way. Rather than fighting fear, we understand it has no foundation in spiritual reality. We see through it to the truth. Amanda, a schoolteacher, joined the group carrying years of anxiety about her own adequacy and worth. She constantly feared she was not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough. This fear colored every interaction and decision in her life. Joshua introduced her to Goldsmith's teaching that we are not human beings trying to become spiritual. We are spiritual beings who have forgotten our true nature. Our worth is not earned through achievement or proven through performance. It is inherent in our existence as expressions of divine life. This idea was difficult for Amanda to accept. Her entire identity had been built around striving to prove her value. The suggestion that she was already complete, already worthy, already enough seemed too simple. Surely she had to do something to earn peace and self-acceptance. But Goldsmith taught that this very striving is what blocks us from experiencing our inherent wholeness. When we chase after what we already have, we perpetuate the illusion of lack. When we try to become what we already are, we deny our true identity. Amanda began practicing what Goldsmith called the art of meditation, which is simply resting in the awareness of God's presence, not trying to achieve anything or become anything, but recognizing what is already true. In these moments, her anxiety would dissolve, replaced by profound peace. The transformation in Amanda was remarkable. As she released her need to prove her worth, she became more effective as a teacher. Her students responded to her newfound calm and confidence. Parents commented on the positive change in her classroom atmosphere. She realized that her previous anxiety had actually made her less capable, not more. Fear had clouded her judgment, blocked her creativity, and exhausted her energy. By understanding why Jesus said, "Fear not," she had accessed an inner resource that made her far more effective. Joshua watched these transformations with gratitude and wonder. He had stumbled upon Goldsmith's teaching in his own darkest moment, and it had changed everything. Now he was privileged to witness the same truth transforming others, each in their own unique way. The group studied Goldsmith's explanation of Jesus' statement, "My peace I give unto you, not as the world gives." The peace Jesus offered was not dependent on circumstances being favorable. It was the peace that comes from knowing the truth about God's presence and power. This peace was what Joshua's grandmother had possessed. It was what sustained Jesus in the boat during the storm. It was what enabled Christopher to remain calm about his daughter's struggle. It was a peace that transcended all understanding because it came from a dimension beyond human reasoning. Brian, a business executive, came to the group with a different kind of fear. He was terrified of failure, of losing his status and success. He worked constantly, driven by anxiety that if he relaxed for even a moment, everything would fall apart. His health was suffering, his marriage strained. Joshua shared Goldsmith's teaching that there is no spiritual law supporting failure or loss. Divine intelligence is always moving toward greater expression, greater good, greater fulfillment. When we align with this movement instead of trying to force outcomes through anxious effort, we work with spiritual law rather than against it. Brian found this counterintuitive. In his world, success came through aggressive action, constant vigilance, and competitive drive. The idea of relaxing into divine flow while trusting spiritual law seemed like a recipe for disaster. Yet he could not deny that his current approach was destroying him. He decided to experiment with a different way of working. Before each meeting or decision, he would take a moment to recognize divine intelligence present and available. He would affirm that the outcome was already established in spiritual reality, and his role was simply to be receptive to guidance. The results surprised him. His meetings became more productive, his decisions more sound. He felt a flow and ease he had never experienced. Most remarkably, his business results actually improved as he released the anxious striving that had dominated his professional life. If you're ready to learn more about living from this higher consciousness, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. Brian shared his experience with the group, his voice filled with amazement. He said he had always thought fear was what kept him sharp and successful. He now realized fear had been his greatest handicap, limiting his vision and exhausting his resources. Joshua explained that this was precisely what Goldsmith meant when he taught about the principle of "my grace is sufficient." When we stop trying to accomplish everything through personal effort and instead become receptive to divine grace, we tap into an infinite resource. This grace is not something we must earn or deserve. It is the natural outpouring of divine love, always available, always sufficient for every need. Fear blocks our awareness of this grace, making us believe we must struggle alone with limited resources against overwhelming odds. The group discussed how prevalent this belief is in modern culture. We are taught that life is a struggle, that we must fight for everything, that only the strong and fearful enough to keep fighting will survive. This worldview guarantees perpetual anxiety and exhaustion. Jesus offered an entirely different paradigm. He lived from the consciousness that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that divine good is immediately available, that we need only recognize and receive what is already given. This is why he could say, "Fear not," with such confidence. Lisa, a retired nurse, brought a question that many in the group had been wondering. If spiritual truth is so powerful and fear is truly powerless, why do bad things still happen? Why do people still suffer despite faith and spiritual practice? Joshua acknowledged the legitimacy and importance of this question. He shared Goldsmith's teaching that we live in a world where most people operate from material consciousness, believing in multiple powers and accepting fear as natural. This collective consciousness creates much of the suffering we see. However, as individuals awaken to spiritual truth and establish themselves in the consciousness of God's presence, they begin to experience a different reality. They are not immune to all challenges, but they navigate them with peace and often see them transformed or resolved in unexpected ways. More importantly, their suffering changes in nature. Even when facing difficulties, they maintain an inner stability and peace that makes the experience entirely different. They know that no material circumstance can touch their true spiritual being or separate them from God's love. Goldsmith taught that Jesus himself faced persecution and crucifixion, yet he went through it without fear, maintaining his consciousness of oneness with God throughout. He demonstrated that, even in the worst material circumstances, spiritual peace and power remain unshaken. The group continued meeting for months, and Joshua watched as lives transformed in remarkable ways. Not everyone's external circumstances changed dramatically, but everyone who committed to the practice experienced the lifting of fear's burden and the emergence of profound peace. He realized that this was Goldsmith's true gift to the world. The teacher had not promised that spiritual understanding would make life easy or problem-free. He had revealed something far more valuable, a way of living that transcends circumstances and remains unshaken regardless of appearances. Joshua began writing about his experience, hoping to reach others who were suffering under the weight of fear. He wrote about that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice explaining why Jesus said, "Fear not." He described the journey from terror to peace. The writing became a book, which he self-published with no expectations. But people began finding it and sharing it with others. The message resonated because fear is perhaps the most universal human experience. Everyone knows its crushing weight and desperate seeks relief. Through emails and messages, Joshua heard story after story of lives transformed by understanding the spiritual principles Goldsmith had taught. People were discovering that fear loses its power when we understand it has no foundation in spiritual truth, when we recognize that God alone is power and presence. One message particularly moved Joshua. It was from a woman named Michelle, whose son had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. She had found Joshua's book in her darkest hour and began applying Goldsmith's principles to her situation. She did not deny the medical diagnosis or refuse treatment, but she established herself in the spiritual truth that her son's eternal being was untouchable by disease. She recognized divine life as the only life, perfect and whole. She practiced seeing her son through God's eyes, not through the lens of fear. The shift in her consciousness affected the entire family. Where there had been despair and panic, peace emerged. Her son felt the change and responded to it. The medical team noticed something different in this family, a calm certainty that seemed to support the boy's healing process. Michelle's son went into remission, defying the doctor's predictions. But as she wrote to Joshua, the real miracle had been her liberation from fear. Even if circumstances had been different, she had discovered a peace that transcended outcomes, a foundation that no external event could shake. This was exactly what Goldsmith had taught. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we are not guaranteed specific material outcomes. We are given something infinitely more valuable, entrance into a consciousness where fear cannot exist, because we know the truth about God's presence and power. Joshua reflected on his journey from that desperate night to this moment of helping others discover the same truth. He saw clearly now that his job loss and financial crisis had been essential to his awakening. Comfort had kept him spiritually asleep. Desperation had opened him to a deeper reality. This is often how spiritual awakening occurs, Goldsmith had explained. When material solutions fail and human resources are exhausted, we become receptive to spiritual truth. Crisis can be the doorway to transformation if we are willing to look beyond material appearances to spiritual reality. The study group had grown beyond Joshua's apartment, and they now met in a rented space. New people arrived each week, each carrying their own burden of fear. Joshua welcomed them, knowing they were about to discover what he had discovered, a truth that would change everything. He always began with new members the same way, sharing his own story and then explaining Goldsmith's core teaching. When Jesus said, "Fear not," he was revealing that fear exists only when we believe we are separate from God, dependent on material circumstances, vulnerable to countless threatening powers. But spiritual truth knows only one power, one presence, one life. In the awareness of this truth, fear dissolves because its foundation disappears. We are not alone, not vulnerable, not dependent on material conditions for our well-being. We are eternal spiritual beings, forever held in divine love. Timothy arrived at the group in crisis. His marriage was ending, his business failing, his health deteriorating. He felt like everything in his life was collapsing simultaneously. The fear was so intense he could barely function, and he came to the group as a last resort. Joshua recognized the desperation because he had been there himself. He knew that Timothy was actually in the perfect position to discover spiritual truth, because his reliance on material solutions was completely exhausted. There was nowhere to turn but inward, to the only source that never fails. Over the following weeks, Timothy learned to practice what Goldsmith called the tabernacle within. Several times each day, he would withdraw from appearances and dwell in the awareness of God's presence. He would recognize that despite all appearances to the contrary, divine order was establishing itself in his life. At first, this seemed like futile escapism while his world burned around him. But gradually, Timothy began to experience what Joshua and others had discovered. A deep peace emerged, entirely independent of his circumstances. In that peace, clarity and wisdom arose where before there had been only panic. Goldsmith had taught that this inner peace is not passive acceptance, but the most powerful force in the universe. It is the atmosphere in which divine intelligence can work, in which solutions can appear, in which transformation becomes possible. Fear blocks this process, while peace enables it. Timothy's external circumstances did not all resolve immediately or easily. His marriage did end, though with far less acrimony than expected. His business required restructuring, but he found creative solutions he would never have seen through the fog of fear. His health began improving as stress decreased. More importantly, Timothy discovered that his sense of well-being no longer depended on any of these external factors. He had found something that could not be taken away, could not fail, could not disappoint. He had discovered his true foundation in spiritual reality. This was the ultimate meaning of Jesus' words, "Fear not." Not a command to suppress natural human emotions, but an invitation to discover the consciousness Jesus himself lived from. A consciousness where fear is impossible because we know ourselves to be inseparable from infinite good. The study group had become a community of people who had made this discovery. They came from different circumstances and backgrounds, but they shared a common experience. They had touched something real, something that transcended all material conditions, something that brought genuine peace. Joshua often thought about Goldsmith and the gift he had given the world. The teacher had spent his life illuminating these spiritual principles, helping people understand the practical implications of spiritual truth. His words had reached across time to save Joshua in his darkest hour. Years passed, and Joshua continued sharing what he had learned. His book reached more people, the study group continued to grow, and lives kept transforming. But he never lost sight of the simple truth at the heart of everything, the truth that had saved him. When we understand why Jesus said, "Fear not," we discover that fear is not overcome through courage or willpower. It dissolves through understanding. When we see clearly that God alone is power and presence, when we know ourselves to be inseparable from this infinite source, fear has no place to exist. This understanding must be renewed daily because the material world constantly contradicts it. Appearances suggest we are vulnerable, separate, dependent on favorable circumstances. The news, our bank accounts, our bodies, other people's opinions, all seem to confirm the reality of threat and danger. But spiritual truth remains unchanged by appearances. God is still the only power, still completely present, still expressing as infinite good. Our work is to remember this truth, to dwell in this awareness, to see from this consciousness rather than from the consciousness of fear. Joshua had discovered that this practice was not escape from reality, but engagement with true reality. The material world of appearances is the illusion. Spiritual truth is the reality. As we dwell in spiritual truth, even the appearance begins to reflect more harmony, more good, more of what we have always sought. On the anniversary of that desperate night when he first heard Goldsmith's voice, Joshua sat in quiet gratitude. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this truth, all the fear that had been lifted, all the peace that had been discovered. He understood now that his grandmother's peace had not been mysterious or unattainable. She had simply understood what Jesus meant by fear not. She had lived from the consciousness of God's presence, and that consciousness had sustained her through every circumstance. This same peace was available to everyone, not through special gifts or exceptional holiness, but through simple understanding. When we grasp that we are not separate from our source, that divine intelligence and love are always present and available, fear loses its foundation and power. Joshua looked at the group gathering for their weekly meeting. New faces mixed with familiar ones, all seeking the same thing, relief from fear's crushing weight. He knew that each person who truly understood these principles would go on to help others, creating an ever-widening circle of peace. This was Goldsmith's legacy and Jesus' gift to humanity, not a religion or philosophy to believe in, but a truth to be experienced, a truth that sets us free from fear and establishes us in the consciousness of infinite good, a truth that transforms everything when we finally understand why Jesus said, "Fear not." In that understanding lies the peace that surpasses all human comprehension, the peace that is our true nature and eternal inheritance. If this teaching has touched your heart, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment sharing your experience with fear, and join our community of spiritual seekers discovering the peace that Jesus promised.